We're now going to be talking about how to make sure that you obtain informed consent from your respondents and how to protect their confidentiality. So, to obtain consent, before you conduct the interview, you want to make sure that your participant has a general understanding of the topic of the interview, who's conducting the interviews, the organization you're representing, how the data is going to be used for a report, for planning future activities, what, if any, identifying information is going to be recorded, is their name going to be kept with the interview, which it shouldn't be, how are the notes or record recordings going to be kept, how are they going to be stored, are they going to be destroyed. You should let them know that they don't have to answer any questions that they don't want to, that they can stop at any time in the interview. So not only can they say, I don't want to answer this question, can we go to the next one? They can also say, I'm sorry, I don't want to answer any more questions, and leave. You also want to make sure that you have consent to record the interview as well. One question is, should you obtain written consent? So should they sign a consent form that they understand this, or is verbal consent okay? For interviews that you're conducting for your organization, typically verbal consent is fine. And often this is a better strategy because it makes the interview less formal. That the interviewer isn't signing their name, there's no documentation of their name, that they've conducted this interview. They might feel a bit more comfortable participating and being honest in the interview that they're not signing their name, especially if you are in a political or social setting where people are concerned about the government using potentially using interviews to hold dissidents accountable or to come after people. It's a very good idea not to have people sign their name. And you also want to stress in the interview that you're not acting on behalf of the government and that the government won't have access to this information. Depending on the social and cultural context, you may need additional consent from a parent or a spouse, even if the person you're interviewing is an adult themselves. So whatever the social or cultural context is, make sure that you follow with this. If you're interviewing a child, you always want to obtain consent from the parents. You should also have a handout with the information that you've gone over verbally, so about the topic of the interview, the organization, and also to have contact details for your organization in case your respondent has questions later on. It's very important that you ensure the confidentiality of your respondent, that they are taking the time to come and to take part in an interview with you and answering your questions honestly, so you want to make sure to protect their confidentiality. You want to conduct the interview in private. So this means that there aren't relatives or friends listening in. This is both important for their confidentiality, that they feel free to answer honestly. It's also important for the quality of your data as well too, that you're only getting the opinions of the person you're interviewing and not their friends or family. It's also important that they answer honestly. If you're asking about gender equality in the home, and you're interviewing a wife and her husband is in the same room, she probably isn't going to answer as honestly as if he wasn't there. So you want to make sure to conduct the interview in private. It's possible that depending on who you're interviewing, they might have a young child with them. This isn't ideal, but it tends not to make as much of a difference in the interview as having an adult in the room. You don't want to record the name of your participant in your notes. So if you have your interviewer guide and you're taking notes on them, you don't want to write the name of your participant at the very top of the interview. A lot of times people will write down a number or a code that helps them remember who they're interviewing, but they don't have the name of the person they're interviewing on the interview notes itself. And you may, if you have a list of names and interview codes, you keep those separate, that they aren't kept with the actual interview notes themselves. You want to, as an organization, keep the recording and notes locked in your office to protect privacy, and so that not everyone in your office has access to them. Only the people actually conducting the interview data analysis will be able to look at them. When you're writing about your respondent, so in any document that is going to go beyond the interviewer, so any internal document, any public document, don't use the name of your respondent. Don't said, as so and so said. You want to make, even if you don't use their last name or family name, don't use their name whatsoever. If you want to use a name, create a pseudonym, create a fake name to refer to them to. You also don't want to share any identifying information. So, one good thing that interviews are really good for, or for finding out stories or experiences that you might use in advocating why your campaign is important. So you might tell the story of a woman who decided to run for political office. Maybe she won, maybe she didn't. But you're talking about what she's actually saying, the support she received from her family. You don't want to have a collection of information that could identify your respondent. So, for example, you don't want to say, that so and so, who was 39 years old and raising two children in this neighborhood and worked as a social worker, decided she wanted to run for politics. There's a good chance that if someone reads that, they could figure out who you're talking about, and this would break the confidentiality of your respondent. So if you do want to share the story, you want to strategically change a few of these key details. Details that aren't going to change the overall point that you're trying to make. So for example, instead of saying she was 39, you might say she was 36, 42. Probably doesn't make a big difference, so it's okay to change that if you're doing it to change their confidentiality. Or instead of saying she was working as a social worker, you might say that she was working in a hospital or working as a teacher, some kind of similar job, or you might say she's working in social services. So you want to change enough things that there's no way that anyone reading it would know who you were talking about. You might say instead of two children, she had one child or three children. You might change several of these all at once, so that way there's no way that they could be identified. The experience is still the same, and the person still has children, they're still around the same age, working the same type of job, but again, it's to protect this individual. So it's okay to change this information if you're only doing it to protect the confidentiality. So now that you have obtained informed consent and ensured the confidentiality of your respondent, you can now conduct the interview. So a few things to think about before you actually begin asking the interview questions. You want to make sure that you dress professionally. Again, you're representing an organization. If you go to someone else's home to conduct the interview, and interviews are commonly conducted in the respondent's home, let another person know where you'll be going. This way, if something happens, if there's an emergency, people will know where you are and be able to find you. You should arrive on time for interviews. Again, the participant, the respondent, is providing you with their time. They might not have time to conduct the interview if you're running late, or you might not be able to finish the entire interview. So you want to respect the participant's time. You don't want to accept food or drink if you conduct the interview in someone's home unless it would be considered culturally rude to not to. You want to be friendly, but you don't want to be overly friendly. You're not their friend. This will bias the interviews if they feel like you're their friend and that they may feel more pressure to answer in a certain way because they want your approval. It also might send mixed messages or the wrong signals that people might take it as flirting if you're too friendly. So again, you want to maintain a professional demeanor. You also want to avoid taking risks with your personal safety. This means if you're interviewing someone and the person makes comments that start to make you feel really uncomfortable or you feel safe, or if you're going to a neighborhood to interview someone and it doesn't feel safe to you, then you should cancel the interview. Contact the respondent and cancel the interview, or tell the respondent that you have to leave, that you should prioritize your own safety. Another common question is, should you record the interview either with a digital recorder or with a cell phone? If at all possible, we would encourage you to record the interview for several reasons. This allows the interviewer to focus more on the participant and what they're saying and to ask good follow-up questions. There's a lot of information to take in, so if you were having to take notes, you'd be missing a lot of things. A recording enables you to go back and later review the nuances of the interview, and also enables you to use exact quotes. However, recordings do have drawbacks. Participants, even if they say it's okay that you record them, they still may be uncomfortable with a recorder running, and they might censor themselves, especially about sensitive topics. Um, that they just might not be comfortable that there's a recording of them out there somewhere, or out there with you, of them talking. Additionally, if you record, you have to go back and listen through audio, and this is time consuming, so think you have probably at least an hour for every single interview. If you had 40 interviews, it's going to take at minimum 40 hours just to listen to them, and even longer if you're trying to write down portions of those interviews, even if it's just a few quotes from the interviews. Um, However, even given these drawbacks, we'd encourage you to record it if possible, if you're not interviewing about too sensitive a topic, and if your respondent agrees to be interviewed with the recording taking place. Even if you'd like to record it, if the respondent says, no, it's not okay that you record me, you should always follow the wishes of your respondents. Don't try to secretly record them. In that case, if they don't want to be recorded, you just have to do the best you can in taking notes at the same time. If you do use a recorder, try to make the recorder be unobtrusive, not to stand out. So you don't want to be sitting across a table from a respondent and put the recorder right in the middle between you and the respondent. So that way the respondent is thinking about it again and again. You might notice that the participant might seem uncomfortable by the recorder. Maybe they keep looking at it. If they keep looking at it, this means they're probably thinking about it and thinking about their answers, knowing that they're getting recorded and they might be censoring themselves. If it seems like they're uncomfortable, offer to turn the recorder off. You want to prioritize getting good data. It might seem obvious, but make sure whatever device you're using to record is charged and is actually recording. I think every person I've known who's conducted interviews has had at least one interview that they've conducted, and either the recorder has run out of battery halfway through, or they get to the end and they realize that the recorder wasn't actually on. So make sure that it's recording. Make sure that you take a few notes, even if you're recording, so that way if there is a problem with the recorder later on, or if the file gets deleted, you don't lose all of the information. A few more things to keep in mind as you conduct the interview. Remember, you're having a conversation with your respondent. Have some easy initial questions to warm them up, to make them feel comfortable with you. Go through your interview guide question by question, but feel free to move around. If the respondent brings up a point you're going to discuss later on, or if you have a follow-up question. Feel free to ask follow-up questions as needed, and also ask for clarifications. Again, the point of doing interviews is that you can ask follow-up questions and you can ask for clarification and additional information. So take advantage of these advantages that are inherent in interviews. So now we're going to talk about how to probe, so how to elicit, how to get more information from your participant. So for example, the participant might say that he or she doesn't know or doesn't understand the question. So we could imagine that the interviewer asks, in your opinion, what is the most important campaign issue in the election? And the respondent says, I don't know. Or maybe they say, I don't understand the question. There are a few different things that you as an interviewer can do. If they say, I don't know, you can say, well, what do you think? And maybe the respondent will say, well, I guess probably education. Or if you think that the respondent doesn't understand what the question is, rephrase the question. And again, it's important that the interviewer understands the purpose of the interview for the organization, because this allows them to better rephrase the question. So you might rephrase the question. During the election campaign, political parties have discussed a number of different issues. You might have seen campaign ads for them. Which of these issues is the most important to address? And hopefully you'll rephrase it in a way that the respondent understands and they're able to answer. If the respondent declines to answer a question twice or has a lot of trouble understanding a question, go ahead and move on to the next question. You don't want to frustrate the respondent. So what if the participant's answer is very short and or unclear? So, for example, the interviewer might say, so in your opinion, what are the most important campaign issues in this election? And the respondent says, trash. This doesn't tell you a whole lot, so there are different strategies that you could use. So you could say, could you tell me more about that? So what do you mean by that? What do you mean by trash? Could you give me an example? All these things, all these phrases are ways to get the respondent to give you more information, to give you more details. So the respondent might say, the municipality needs to ensure that trash doesn't collect on the street. It smells and it's a public hazard. So you've got a whole lot more information about what the issue of trash actually means. So what if the participant gave you a really long, complicated answer, or if you're taking notes, you're not sure if you've got it all written down? As an interviewer, you can say, okay, so let me make sure I have your answer recorded correctly. And they repeat the answer. And then they say, is that correct? And if they've left something out that the respondent has previously said, the respondent can correct them or add to that. Over the course of the interview, you don't want to just be asking questions. You also want to provide feedback to your respondents. However, you want to make sure that you don't provide feedback that influences or biases the participants' answers. So for example, you don't want to lead the participant to think that you're looking for a certain answer, that you want them to answer in a certain way. You should be neutral in how you ask the question. You shouldn't tell participants what you think or personal information. Remember, the interview is not about you. It's about, even though it's a conversation between the two of you, you really want to get the information from the participant and not the other way around. So don't spend the interview sharing common experiences. You also don't want to show surprise or approval or disapproval of a respondent's answers, either verbally or physically. Whatever they say is fine. Your job isn't to judge them about it. Your job is just to record the information. Don't give positive or negative feedback. Again, this might bias the participants to give certain types of answers. So you don't want to say things like, oh, that's great, or say, are you really sure about that? In a way that makes them think that their answers aren't okay. You do want to provide only neutral feedback, so say thank you, that's useful information, okay. And you want to provide this feedback throughout the interview, so that way the interviewer doesn't feel like you're a robot reading one question, then the next question, then the next question, so that way there's some engagement between the two of you. Additionally, you want to be aware of the participant's body language. Does the participant seem uncomfortable? Does the participant seem bored or distracted? If so, you might want to alter the way that you're asking the questions or how long you're spending on the questions. However, some silence is okay. Don't feel that someone has to be talking every single moment. You want to give the participants time to think, and they might need a minute or two to think about how they want to respond to your question. Additionally, try not to interrupt the participant. If the participant is saying something and you think of a follow-up question that you want to ask about this, make a note of it on your interviewer guide so you can come back to it at a later point. At the end of the interview, be sure to ask the participant if they have anything else to add to your conversation, anything that they haven't mentioned that they think is important about the topic. That sometimes people will share really interesting things that just haven't come up. Another strategy is to turn off the recorder and then ask them if they have anything to add. And this gives the participant an opportunity to say something that they might not feel comfortable if it's being recorded. So this is another way to deal with those issues about recording. So now take a few minutes to take the interviewer questions, so the interviewer guide that you drafted earlier. Choose one person to be the interviewer and another to be the participant, and briefly simulate at least part of the interview. It doesn't need to be the entire thing, but maybe a section of questions to allow the interviewer time to practice. That it's hard asking questions, it's hard asking follow-up questions and probing. So it's good to have this practice, and at some point in time you want to do this later with the entire interviewer guide. So doing the interview start to finish, but right now just do a part of it. And when you've done it, go ahead and move on to the next section. So what should you do with your interview data once you've collected it? Immediately after the interviewer should make notes about the interview as a whole. even if they've taken some notes during the interview. You want to think about the interview as a whole. First of all, you want to identify any changes that should be made before the next interview. So, for example, did a respondent not understand a particular question? Is there a problem with the wording? Did you spend too much time on one topic so that you didn't have enough time for the next? So learn from any mistakes that you as an interviewer have made and fix them for the next interview. Next, you want to make notes about initial reactions about the interview as a whole. What were the key themes that emerged? So, um, if you're interested in learning about the role of women in politics, maybe a key theme that emerged was having a female mentor, someone who was a politician that could guide you through the process. And that's something that came up over and over again in the interview. What were the most interesting responses, the most surprising responses? Did you notice any patterns? So this is focusing less on specific questions and more about what you are taking away from the interview as a whole. So you should do this after each interview. You don't need to transcribe all of your interviews. This is time consuming and expensive. Remember, if you conduct 10 interviews, you're probably going to have more than 10 hours of audio recording. It takes a lot of time to record this, and if you have someone else do it, it's really expensive. What you can do is you can listen through the interviews and write down quotable quotes or quotes that you might want to use in your write-ups. Or exchanges between you and the participant that are particularly illuminating. And this is one thing that you can do immediately after you've conducted the interview, is if you know that there are key places that seem like they're going to be something you want to quote or something you want to go back and listen to, you can circle those questions on your interviewer guide, so that way you know that you want to go find that specific question again, so that way you might not have to listen to the entire interview. So as you go back through the interviews, listening to them, reading over your notes, make a note of key themes that emerge, illuminating quotes as well that you want to use later on. Quantitative data or quantitative analysis typically isn't useful for interviews. Remember, you're not going to be interviewing that many people. So it doesn't really make sense to say 60% of your respondents use public transportation. Instead, you'll probably use generalizations, the majority, all but one, most, to talk about what you're finding. Again, remember, because of your sampling strategy and the number of people you're interviewing, you can't generalize to the population as a whole. So you're going to be working with qualitative data. And this is a lot more subjective in terms of how you analyze it. So you want to look at responses to specific question. Are there points of agreement or disagreement across your interviews? Do your respondents seem to agree or disagree that being a mentor is important? You want to identify themes or patterns across the interviews. So things that you can sort of summarize of the people that we interviewed. It seems to be really important to have a mentor, that almost all of the women that did go into politics or ran for political office had a mentor. The one that didn't have a mentor had a grandparent who had participated in politics or had a family member who's involved in politics. So they already knew a bit about it growing up, even if they didn't have a mentor specifically for a political campaign. You want to pay attention to frequency, how many different participants bring up a particular topic or theme. Intensity, so how strongly it's important to them, and specific details. So being a parent, the amount of time that it takes to run for political office. There are two different primary ways of trying to look across your interviews, whether it's 10 interviews, whether it's 40 interviews, and try to be able to come up with some takeaway points from all of these different interviews. The first is to go by question by question. So going through your interviewer guide, for each question, note briefly the response of each respondent, of each participant. You don't need to write it down verbatim, word for word. You just want to write down, say for a question, how important was having a mentor for you? really important. I couldn't have done it without a mentor. I had a mentor, but it didn't feel really important. So you've got all your answers in one place to look at, and you can sort of draw general conclusions from each of these questions. Does there seem to be agreement? Do opinions differ? Do they seem to differ by a particular characteristic? So for women who ran for political office at a younger age, does having a mentor seem to matter more than those that ran for political office at an older age? Again, remember you aren't interviewing that many people, so you have to be careful about drawing broad generalizations. But you can say from the people we interviewed, the respondent's age may seem to be important. Another approach is called the long table method, and this is good for identifying themes that might not come up within a specific question. So listen to the interviews or go back through your notes. Write down on slips of paper the main points that participants make. 1 point per one participant on one sheet of paper. So for example, the first interview, if you're talking about introducing new public transit options, might be concerned about the cost of a light rail. The second might not be concerned about cost. The third might be concerned about environmental impact. You then take all these slips of paper and you spread them out on a table and you rearrange them so you've got the different themes that have emerged over the course of the interview. And it's really helpful to see, well, maybe only 2 people talk about cost, but you have 8 respondents who talk about environmental impact. And you might not have asked a specific question about environmental impact or cost in your interview, but these are things that people bring up. So this is a good way to try to compare across interviews. What themes emerge? What are the most common and or important for the participants? And additionally, what issues weren't discussed by participants that you might have expected them to bring up or that they didn't discuss until you as an interviewer asked a specific question? Sometimes what people don't say is just as important as what they do say. So once you've looked at this data, think about what are your key findings. So you've conducted 10 interviews, 20 interviews. You probably have an idea of what conclusions you can draw from these interviews. So say that you had a colleague that wanted you to tell them in 5 minutes about what you found out from your interviews. What would be the 2, 3, 4 things that you think are most important? These are probably going to be your key findings. Once you have your key findings, go back through your interview notes, the parts of the interview that you've written down, short exchanges, 1 to maybe 3 sentences that seem particularly relevant to support these key findings. So for each key finding, you should find several quotes to support them. So if you say, participants seem particularly concerned about the environmental impact of building a light rail train system. Find 2, 3 quotes of participants saying why the environmental impact is important or how they think about environmental impact in relationship to the light rail system. So you have support, you have evidence for your findings. Then think about what are the implications of your findings. What does the findings mean for your organization, for your campaign? So for example, if you're doing a campaign about encouraging women to participate in politics, one of your key findings might have that mentors are really important. So you might say, one of the implications is that we should work to have a program that matches young women who are interested in politics with mentors who are females that have either run or held political office. So we should design a mentor program. That might be an implication. You should write up a short report, even if it's just for internal use, even if you don't mean to make it public, because if you only keep the interview notes, you don't have any cumulative information that you can share or have for people in your organization to look at. So you should have a report, even if it's short, where you summarize your findings. You also want to be careful not to overstate your findings. Remember, again, on generalization, the number of people that you're interviewing, you can't say, based on our findings, we should devote all of our energies to mentorship at the expense of any other activities, or women will only succeed in politics if they have a mentor. this is really overstating your findings. So you want to be honest about how much you think your findings could be generalizable to the population. But you also might say we need to interview more people, or we need to do more research about the relationship between age and the role of mentorship. And one way you might do this is through designing a survey. That surveys are a natural next step from interviews. So, for example, new ideas generated. You might add response categories, as we discussed before, for survey questions. You might have identified better language. These new ideas, you might decide you want to ask more about age in a survey, you want to ask more about mentorship in a survey. Might ask, additionally, is there support for having a mentorship program? So you might distribute a survey, and based on what you found in your interviews, say, should we, if there was a mentorship program where you were paired with a female politician, do you think you'd be more likely to run for office? Your interviews can also be used for evaluating or designing a future campaign. So if you're evaluating a current campaign, what should be kept? If you're doing it again, what should be modified? What new ideas or activities should you include? New strategies, like a mentorship program? If you're testing campaign messages, do you think that you need to change the campaign message? Or do you think that your campaign message doesn't mirror the concerns of the population that you're interested based on your interviews? You might also decide to present your findings to the public. Again, you can't generalize to the entire population, but can still be useful to present your findings. So you might say there's support or lack of support based on your interviews for introducing a light rail system, for having a mentorship program for potential female candidates. You might discuss concerns that came up from your interview participants that the government might need to address, or that another body might need to address, or that your organization needs to address. You can use specific quotes or stories to communicate your findings. And interviews are great because it really puts a human face on experiences and opinions in a way that surveys don't. However, as we said before, you want to make sure that your respondents aren't identifiable from any of these quotes or stories. And finally, you're probably going to have recommendations or highlight implications of your findings. So making recommendations about implementing a mentorship program, or make recommendations that the government, if they want to introduce a light rail system, has clearly communicated to the public what the environmental impacts are going to be and or have mitigated them. So we've covered a lot of things in this training session about interviews. We've discussed the benefits and disadvantages of semi-structured interviews. In what cases will they be useful for your data collection, how they might work either independently or in conjunction with surveys. We've discussed the importance of designing your interviewer guide, making sure that you've planned out all your questions in advance and practiced all of these questions, even though you have the flexibility to change them during the course of the interview. We've talked about strategies for writing questions that generate useful content, so not asking yes or no questions, asking about specific experiences, avoiding leading questions or loaded terms in your questions as well too. We've also discussed how to find respondents. So what are recruitment strategies? If you're using a convenient sample, what are possible biases in your sample and how you might avoid them? We've also discussed where to hold interviews, how to obtain consent and ensure confidentiality of your respondents. We've discussed some strategies for asking questions in the interview itself. So how to address sensitive questions, how to probe to get additional information from your respondent as well too. And we've also talked about how to use the data you have, how to go in and look at qualitative data and draw conclusions from it. So this has hopefully been useful, and good luck with your interviews.